If you guys wouldn't mind humoring me for just a moment, if you're comfortable sharing this information about yourself, can you raise your hand if you work in the broader public sector in BC? I'm assuming that's probably everyone? Yeah, most people? Okay, and what about the government? Can you raise your hand if you work in the government? Okay, I just want to get an idea of who I'm talking to and how much detail to go into law-wise. So to start off, as Colette mentioned, my name is Rhianna. I'm the Acting Director of Strategic Privacy in Government's Corporate Privacy Branch. So we have the pleasure of providing corporate privacy guidance to all ministries in government. For those of you who aren't familiar or who are maybe, I just want to make sure it's clear what my role isn't. Sometimes our office is confused with the OIPC, so we are not the regulator in BC. But we, of course, work closely and in collaboration with them. So to start off, I'm actually just going to begin with some very basic stuff. I think that everyone is going to know about this, but I'm just going to start really quickly to do some level setting with regards to language. Language, I think, is a really important plays an important part in this space. And the definitions and terminology, I think the way we use these words makes a really big difference in how we think about de-identification. So to start off, the definition of personal information within the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act is up on the board. I think we all probably know what this means, but just to, again, level set a little bit, we're talking about personal information for the obvious things, my health records, my PHN, my ethnicity, my home address, my SIN, lots of obvious things like that. But we also, when we're talking about de-identification, it's important to think a little bit more broadly about what that can mean. So the examples I'm going to use a couple of times throughout what I'm about to talk about are related to the Mosaic Effect. So again, this is a term I'm assuming most people are probably familiar with, but just in case you aren't. The Mosaic Effect refers to the ability to bring disparate pieces of non-identifiable information together to create a picture of who someone is. So the very easy example we often use in training is that if you have an individual, you know that he is a male and he is elderly and he lives in Prince Rupert. We don't know who you're talking about. But if you say that that elderly gentleman who lives in Prince Rupert drives a Rolls Royce, probably a lot of people are going to be able to figure out who you're talking about. So bringing together those pieces of information that may not be personal on their own, but as a collective picture, you can figure out who someone is. That's an important concept when we're talking about de-identification. And again, I'm sure we're all familiar, but wanting to make sure we're level setting a little bit. A couple of examples that I just want to mention at the outset because they might come up as I continue through the slides or in questions related to de-identification. One example I'll talk about is in the health sector. So when you talk about a large, let's say, complex structured health data set, and there are a number of fields that you obviously are going to want to de-identify in order to remove personal information. So removing the name, removing the PHN, removing the birth date, or at least changing it to an age or an age range. These are things that will de-identify the personal information. But paying a close attention to the context of that data is obviously very important because you need to account for things like rare diseases in small populations within that data. A second example that may come up as I continue talking, we'll see where my ramblings go, is an education example that we often talk through. So if you have education results for students in a certain region, you have to think through the small populations that might apply in that data set. So Indigenous outcomes for a certain grade, there may only be a couple of people in a given school district who show up there needing to account for small populations, and data is obviously an important part, and I think ties into the Mosaic Effect, and maybe more importantly with the term indirect identifiers. So again, I think that's a word probably people are familiar with, but a direct identifier is going to be something that directly ties you to me. An indirect identifier is something that may tie you to me when you begin to, through the Mosaic Effect, put pieces of information together. So it's just a couple of quick terms for level setting, and they'll come up again as I continue. So to start off with, I'm going to talk about the problems that we in the corporate office in the BC government have noticed or have had brought to our attention from ministry staff for a number of years. So people, I think, struggle with de-identification in the ministries, probably everywhere, but I'll speak to what I know, because it's really complicated. With the utmost respect for the very intelligent people I'm standing with, they are talking about things at a level at times when we're chatting in between session that is beyond me. I'm not a mathematician. I can't talk about algorithms. It's very intimidating, and I think people start to hear that conversation and get nervous. I think we work in an environment that's very privacy focused because of our law, and there's a sincere aversion to risk and wanting a fear of doing the wrong thing. So people will often come to our office asking for guidance on how they should tackle a de-identification problem, how they should even start the conversation. So that was maybe the first step for talking about de-identification policy or guidance in the provincial government context. And there's a couple specific things that we also identified as problems, more than that general kind of fear. The first is a wide range of practices across government. So in some ministries, in particular in the social sector, you'll find there are sincere experts, people like data scientists, people who are very comfortable in this space, very comfortable dealing with research with personally identifiable data, very comfortable with the conversation around de-identification. And on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, you'll have people in government who don't know what any of the words I've just said mean. And that's a pretty big range, and it's a pretty big gap to fill from a corporate policy perspective. But that was one of the first objectives that we've tried to tackle, is kind of level setting, creating a common dialogue for employees across ministries, and trying to create a path to both push and pull those experts and those people who are maybe less familiar into a central framework, a central way of talking about de-identification. Another thing that we often hear is that different from expertise and comfort, there are different cultures within ministries. So some ministry cultures are perhaps very risk averse. We hear that it's difficult to get information out of those ministries, or for those informations to feel enabled to share information. And that's on one end of the spectrum, but on the other end of the spectrum, we have people who, maybe are taking more risky practices, don't even know what the word re-identification means. So again, we're trying to push and pull folks in the ministries into a central place where they're not taking unnecessary risk, and they're not taking an unnecessarily conservative stance when talking about de-identifying information, but rather sharing a common language, common approach, common risk-based framework for thinking about de-identification. And the third problem that we encounter is that the word de-identification, it can mean a lot of things. One of my earlier conversations with Clive with privacy analytics, he mentioned that the terms are always problematic, and there is no perfect set of terminology out there. So with that in mind, I think we all felt confident in our office to start to, there's no perfect solution here, so let's try to create a solution for the BC government about language. And so that is an important objective that we've been working with. And the last thing I'll mention as a goal that we've been working towards is finding a solution that both provides guidance for that complex health data set over here, where there are really skilled data scientists, data folks working on the data, versus maybe over here where they don't have a complex data set including personal information, but maybe they're looking to anonymize names in a report before publishing it online. So technically that's de-identification, and we need to talk about how to provide guidance for all of these things. And in all of the examples I've just talked through, our goal is to pull folks into the center for a common risk-based approach and a common set of terms to begin to talk about how to de-identify information across government. So our goal, well, my goal, maybe my team is a little bit less quirky than me, but my goal is to be able to look at this graphic, which is really fuzzy because I'm not allowed to take the real ones that are less fuzzy off the internet. That's not allowed. So mind the fuzziness, but the meaning is still there. The goal is to be able to give the people on this side of the spectrum the confidence to say, you really can't find Waldo. It's okay. And to maybe pull the folks over here who take a quick glance and say, well, I don't know, I can't see him, he's not there, to take a second look and dig a bit deeper to ensure that appropriate practices are in place. So just because I can't find him doesn't mean he's not there, and we want to help folks have the confidence to say, no, he's really not here. So that's one of our primary objectives. So just to summarize our goals of what we've been looking at based on the issues we've been facing is to better enable ministries to engage in meaningful information sharing and research. We want to help support the shift in government culture that data is something that we understand that can be used when done so responsibly and lawfully. We want to ensure that when ministries are disclosing information that has been de-identified, they are doing so either responsibly or lawfully, depending on what the information looks like. And our goal is to encourage consistency in definition, language, and practice of anonymization across government. So we believe we have created a path forward for that. But again, before I get into the details of that, I'm going to spend some time talking about terminology because I think it's one of the most important first steps. So, no perfect terms. Thank you for that piece of wisdom. It was really helpful for us. There are lots of words that are used in this space, and one of the things that we kept encountering is some confusion about the fact that the word de-identification seems to be used as both a verb and a noun. So our guidance and policy that we're developing will use the word de-identification as a verb. So you will de-identify information and it will result in two different products, both of which are de-identified records, but we will call them either partially de-identified records or anonymized records. Partially de-identified records, for those of you who are familiar with privacy analytics terminology or GDPR terminology, is pretty similar to, and I really suck at saying this word, but pseudonymized records. We'll see if we did that right. But it's too hard to say, and so if I can't say it, how many people in ministries who don't do this work any day are going to say it? So we've gone with partially de-identified records. Our definition is ever so slightly different, and anonymized records. So for just a quick moment, I'll read out our proposed definition of de-identification, which we're currently in draft on, and I'll get into that in a bit. But de-identification is a process that removes or transforms direct and indirect identifiers in a record. De-identification methods can include many things, which I'm not going to get into because it'll feel silly for me to say the methods that I know about with these people sitting up here next to me. So if you have questions about that, I'm going to happily defer over there. And de-identified processes will result in either partially de-identified records or anonymized records. Another word I just want to briefly touch on is aggregation or aggregate records. We find that that word is often used synonymously with anonymized records, and we will intentionally define that in a different way because you can aggregate records to such a level that they may still have small populations, which could include personally identifiable information. So we've explicitly sought to define those words to create some consistency for government in how they're used. On the screen here is a snip from our proposed and draft policy and guidance document where we look to define partially de-identified records and anonymized records. I think it's fairly intuitive, hopefully based on how I've talked about this for the last few minutes, but partially de-identified records being records that you've manipulated with de-identification, but not to the point where they have been anonymized. So there are still indirect identifiers included in the records. The guidance that we have developed will apply as a resource, but there would be, under our proposed draft work, there would be no policy constraints on the partially de-identified records. Anonymized records are records that have been de-identified to the point where there is no longer any personal information. Because of that, we want to ensure that the policy controls we put in place support ministry employees to responsibly deal with those records, and in particular, if they're looking to disclose those records, responsibly disclose those records. So the policy that's been drafted will apply to the disclosure of anonymized records, and the guidance that has been developed will be available as a resource for that process. Next, I want to talk about the anonymized, what we're actually drafting. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the draft anonymization policy, and that is a document which will provide guidance to ministry employees and mandatory requirements to ministry employees on what they must do in order to disclose records as anonymized. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the de-identification guidance, which is a tool that ministries will be able to use to assess risk and think about de-identification from that central point of a central government framework. So anonymized records, the first thing is that it will outline the mandatory requirements for ministries when disclosing information if it has been anonymized. The goal here is to recognize that there are specific controls that a ministry must consider before they move forward with disclosing anonymized records. One thing that we noticed is that ministries are treating de-identification as the same thing. So anonymized records and partially de-identified records, ministry employees are grappling with the issues in the same way, and our contention or our argument is that the things that you need to do to disclose partially de-identified records, say as the Ministry of Education to a school district, are very different than if you want to disclose records that have been anonymized to, say, a commercial partner for profit purposes. So the ethics involved, the controls involved, the risk mitigation strategies involved in those two things are totally different. And our goal is to parse out the disclosure of anonymized records so that the necessary and appropriate controls are dedicated there as opposed to over the whole expanse of de-identified records where they might not be necessary to the extent as you would with anonymized records. So again, the proposed policy that we're working on would apply to the disclosure of anonymized records only, and where the disclosure of anonymized records would not be authorized under law. Policy and controls will include at a very high level an obligation to consider risks, an obligation to consider the risks associated with both the data and the disclosure setting. So the context would be, I think, the term that privacy analytics would use. Risk mitigation controls and risks of re-identification. So we're trying to layer in the ethics piece and the responsibility that that we think the law builds in when there's personal information. We're trying to layer in those controls where there would be no law applying to that disclosure. The next slide on the screen is the last section or the last page of our proposed de-identification guidelines. So I'll just walk you through really quickly what, from like a heading perspective, what is in the de-identification guidance. So the first step we want ministry employees to think through is the intended disclosure. So we want you to think about, why are you doing the thing that you're doing? We want to be contributing to that culture shift and enabling meaningful information sharing in government. And so we want you to think about, what would happen if you don't do this? Is there public good involved? Is there a loss to public good if you don't participate? We want you to think about the fact that if it's FOIPA that's enabling you to make that disclosure, that isn't it, unless there's a public interest Section 25 factor involved, there isn't anything compelling you to. So even if it's authorized by FOIPA, do you want to participate in the thing that you're looking to do? So the intended disclosure assessment is meant to kind of set your context for yourself. Why are you doing the thing that you're doing, and should you bother doing it? Or probably more significantly in government's context, what would be the negative that would come out of not participating? The next thing we want you to think about is risk assessment, risk mitigation controls, and then an overall risk rating. You'll see on the bottom spectrum there's a risk rating that you will plot from high to low, and that's based on detailed questions from a risk assessment perspective of risk assessment related to risk, intended disclosure, who are you giving it to? Are they a trusted partner? So there's lots of content in there to guide your risk assessment of the risks associated with what you're intending to do. The next step is to assess your de-identification level and method, and you'll see that on the left-hand side. The de-identification level and method assessment is a question for you about the amount of de-identification that you intend to employ. This I happily turn over to these folks if you have questions about this, but the goal here is not to do more than is necessary and to ask questions of yourself to ensure you're doing enough. So this asks, like, methods. Are you looking to delete columns? Are you looking to randomize columns in your data? Things like that. But it also asks level. So let's take a very simple example. If you're looking at removing a birth date, are you just deleting that column? Are you replacing it with the age? Are you replacing it with an age range? So it walks you through those types of questions, and then ultimately at the end of that section you'll be able to plot the level and method as high or low. And then I hope it's fairly intuitive that you will be able to map, join your two axes together to find out whether you're in one of the four quadrants. So if you find yourself in the balance quadrant, the guidance will propose that you can continue with what you're doing. If you find yourself in the conservative quadrant, the guidance will tell you to think about what you're doing. Go back to that intended disclosure assessment that you started at the beginning. Have you de-identified to the point where you've lost utility of the data? Have you put on so many risk mitigation controls, and maybe are some of those unnecessary given the trusted relationship and partnership you have with where you're disclosing in the information? We will never go as far as to say you shouldn't be conservative, because there are probably lots of instances where a conservative approach is appropriate, but we'll ask you to pause and consider whether or not a conservative approach is appropriate in that instance. And then of course you may wind up in that dreaded red square. So if you're looking at anonymized data, the policy and the guidance document will tell you to stop. It would never be appropriate to disclose anonymized data in a hazardous environment, because if it's anonymous, you don't have the controls that FOIPA would provide to you. So we will tell you not to disclose anonymized information if you're hazardous. If it's partially de-identified information and you have an authority under FOIPA to share the information in its personal form, you may wish to proceed, but the policy and guidance, the guidance document will give you a pause and tell you to think about whether there are potentially additional risk mitigation controls to layer in, and or additional de-identification may need to be applied. So that's the guidance, the points of assessment in the guidance and the decision-making tool that we are proposing to provide to you. The last thing I'll just mention, and I include this slide not so much because I think any of you will follow this methodology when writing your de-identification policy, but rather just to talk about what we're doing right now. So one thing that was mentioned earlier was, I think it was the Alberta example, you used the word creating a recipe for de-identification. I don't know if I would go as far as to say our goal from the corporate policy guidance perspective is to create a recipe. Maybe like a Jamie Oliver recipe where you say a pinch of this, a pinch of that. We're not going to tell you exactly what you need to do to de-identify information, because I don't think that would be appropriate from a corporate perspective. It matters, the context of your data matters, the content of the disclosure matters. But we do want to tell you how to think about de-identifying information, so you have the dialogue and the framework to approach the conversation consistently across government and take concrete actions to move forward, instead of feeling sort of stuck in this space of lack of confidence, lack of information, lack of a tool to even approach executive to talk to them about de-identification. So this just quickly talks about what we've done. We spent a lot of time researching, initial drafting, consultation across government and with some key stakeholders, privacy analytics, and folks outside of government. We then ran a focus group where we gave the products to people who didn't know what we were talking about and asked them to tell us if it made sense, because one of our primary goals is to take all of those fabulous resources that Claude pointed to at the beginning and boil them down into a bit more accessible language. So did people understand what we were saying? Based on that feedback, more revisions. We're in a potentially final phase of consultation right now. We're currently in the middle of consulting with the Commissioner's Office. I'm sure we will have feedback from that results in revision, and then we'll be looking for approval. So it's difficult to say when the policy and guidance will be done, because government is government, but in the coming weeks and months, we're hoping that the content will be finalized and available for ministry use. So that's it for me.